we wanted to talk about being a socially conscious CEO and company. And one of the things I wanted to start out talking about is something that Boston Scientific is doing. Companies usually do this under duress, from shareholder pressure, which is publicly reporting diversity and inclusion statistics. And you started this last year. And can I
Right.
say some of the numbers? This is pretty amazing. They report the number of women, 46.5% last year. People of color, 31.7%. You report even by management level. You got those memorized?
I do. So why do we do all this stuff? So first of all, good morning. Thanks for organizing Hubby. This is not your artist presentation. I'm not very good at that. Just very quickly, and I'll get to the questions. For those, I'll give you a quick commercial on Boston Scientific. For those who are less familiar with the company, we are a medical technology company. It's primarily an interventional medicine. So if you had a parent or grandparent who's had a drug-eluting stent put in, or to treat atrial fibrillation, so it's interventional medicine, typically not surgical. So, for example, you can replace an aortic heart valve through a catheter, and the patient stays in the hospital one night, whereas in the past they would have a 2-week surgery. So it's primarily an interventional medicine company. There's 7 divisions: cardiology, neurology, endoscopy, electrophysiology, neuromodulation. So it kind of covers the body, but mainly think of it as interventional. And we have about 35,000 employees or so. But to your specific question on the diversity metrics, it's talked about in the news a lot, and you've seen things with the Business Roundtable and so forth. But we know the biggest underlying premise is a more diverse workforce from a company standpoint is good for shareholder value creation, because you drive more innovation in the company. You better match your employee base with your customer. And we're also a global company. We serve in 130 countries, and half our sales are outside the U.S. And so to be like only white male doesn't work really well. So what we've also figured out is, over the years, I've been with Boston for 8 years, it's always been on our values and so forth, but we make less traction than we want. And I think that's pretty common with most companies. And I've worked for 3 or 4 companies. And so we created what we call these specific goals. And it's 10%, 20%, 40%. So we want to be a top 10 company in the world in terms of our inclusion metrics. So it's considered a safe and welcoming place, uniquely good in that area. So we want to be a top 10 company in the world in that regard. The second metric is a 20% people of color at the supervisory level. So what happens with many companies is you focus on people of color, again, for the benefits of diversity and innovation, and then we tend to lose employees. So we have a specific goal of 20% people of color in the supervisory role. And then similarly on women, the 40% goal. We have a goal of 40% of our female workforce being at the supervisory level. And we do that because we find that having goals like that will then drive underlying strategies. It's nice to say we want to improve diversity, but if you have specific goals that way, it changes your strategies on how to recruit and things that you do to recruit in those ways.
Now, why did you decide to make them public? I mean, you started doing was it last year you started to make these numbers public? I read a statistic, there was a 2017 study of the Fortune 500 companies, and I think only a fraction of them reported diversity numbers of any kind. So you are in the minority here, but you're leading on this. So why public? Why go public?
Well, I think we went public on it, one, because we wanted to show the world that it means a lot to us, and it's important to us. And selfishly, it helps us attract talent. When there's greater awareness that is that important, that we'll publish data. So it helps us attract more talent, and people feel it's a safer place to work and more inclusive and open to it. So I think, one, selfishly, it helps us differentiate and maybe attract people. Secondly, we're very, it's a public company. We're financially oriented. We have lots of analytics and we're kind of motivated by delivering on our targets. And so we felt, since we were lacking some progress, I would say, we felt like making it public and making a clear stance within our employee base that this is important would force new strategies in order to deliver those goals. And that's exactly what's happening.
Were you ever worried that these might feel like quotas?
We get that question a lot. We don't view it as a quota. Hopefully, we'll exceed it. But if we miss it by a point, it's not like we're going to shop everybody's bonus. But it's more, we view it as a goal, and it's just important. Just like we talk about innovation in the company constantly. We talk about growing faster than our competitors and delivering income faster than sales. We have all kinds of metrics. We feel like it's just important to declare more publicly and with more measurements that this is important to us, rather than have it just be a kind of a nice cause. And you saw the business roundtable topics that came up, which is terrific. Lots of companies talking about it, but we've talked about it. We feel like more specific actions are what's needed. And examples now is we have a very programmatic recruiting efforts with African American colleges in terms of engineering. And a few years ago, we didn't do that. So I think we brought in maybe 75 interns last year because we've been developing those relationships over the past 2 or 3 years. We do the same thing with Hispanic engineers. We do tons of work in STEM. But I think if we didn't have those specific goals in place and a focus on it, then those strategies that would actually recruit wouldn't be as robust as they are.
So diversity at companies, it's not, as you said, it's not about just doing the right thing. I mean, it's about creating a culture that drives innovation and new products. And I was wondering if you can give us an example of how diversity of a team enhanced innovation at Boston Scientific. Yeah,
so some companies do this. We have employee resource groups. I don't know how many we have. I think we have maybe 10 of them. And so you'll have a African American employee resource group. You have an LGBTQ employee resource group, a young professional network group, veterans group, Hispanic group. And so those groups get together across the globe in their different local facilities, and they're championed by an executive committee member that reports to myself. And our executive committee members are measured on that. And so what happens to these employee resource groups, I'll get to your question in a minute. One is used for networking within. So if you're a African American employee and you're new to Boston Scientific, you automatically now have a network of employees, maybe outside of your specific job or function, that you can learn more about the company and just have a broader network. So beyond the networking and social things, we also ask them, the employee resource groups, to focus on innovation and how can you help the company besides retention. And a couple examples of it, I would say with the African American group. One is when you think of clinical trials, whether it's a biotech company or a med device company, you create a new product, then you have to do these expensive, long clinical trials to see if the product works before it gets FDA approved. And typically our clinical trials are run by the same hospitals that don't have the same diversity metrics that we want within our clinical trials. And so recently we've gone through a phase where we're actually looking at our clinical trial hospitals. Maybe there's, say, 500 of them around the world, but what's the diversity of those hospitals within their patient group? And are we going to get the right level of diversity from those actual clinical trials? And so that's been a recent change that's been pushed on by our ERG group and also supported by the African American interventional cardiologist. We've also done a lot of work in drug-eluting stents. If your mom or grandparents had a heart attack, you have a stent that clears that. And typically, those enrolled in those clinical trials are predominantly white males like myself. And there's a disparity of health care for these types of procedures with women and people of color. And so between our women's group and our African American groups, we focused on this, and we actually developed a new trial called the Platinum Diversity Trial, which was focused purely on African American and women, where there's more healthcare disparities. And we found we worked with different hospitals. We found an incredibly high enrollment rate, and we were able to publish some unique clinical data to the interventional cardiology community about the disparity and how women and men of color oftentimes will need PCI earlier but are tended to have less of an opportunity for it.
Yeah, I've read a lot about the disparities in clinical trials, so it's great to hear that you guys are doing this. I mean, do you know if other companies, I mean, have you shared some of your lessons or the way your best practices on this with other companies? Do you think? No?
We don't want to do
Just, you guys want to own it, right?
We want to own it.
Because that is a really big problem, right? The hospitals struggle with, you hear this a lot about women, black patients, companies historically and hospitals historically have not studied their particular needs as patients. And so I'm curious, like, how it's great what you guys are doing. I would love this for all the other companies to do the same thing. Like, is there an effort to do that as well?
I think I was just kidding.
I know.
I was just kidding. We want the greater good. We want to win with our innovation and sales, but there's some things that the whole industry. So we have a lot of work to do. We're certainly trying new things. Our head of diversity says it's progress over time, not overnight. So we just put more emphasis on it, and we have a lot of learning to do. But we also have this group called Close the Gap. And so again, we do it for our business interests as well. So I think you really have to align all these, whether it be these community efforts. It is a public company. And so we often find that these efforts also do align with creating shareholder value, because if it didn't, as a public company, it's difficult to kind of justify it. And so we have something called Close the Gap. And so what they'll do is they'll work, many teams around the US oriented, and they'll work with different hospitals on this disparities. And we'll do analysis with the hospital on disparities because the CEOs are motivated by it. And we help drive awareness, whether it be diabetes or blood pressure. So we do a lot of community service like that with our Close the Gap team, with hospitals, to kind of elevate this disparities matter.
So when companies step up on diversity and inclusion efforts, some white men feel under attack. And I often ask this of white male CEOs, of which there are many of you. And so what would you say to white men who feel like it's a zero-sum game? And how do you get them to feel like they are part of diversity and inclusion efforts and not on the other side of it?
Well, it is such quite frankly, an advantage. I think Fortune just presented the most innovative companies, and we were in the top 20 of that. And then Fortune received some flack from the media because I think there was, of the top 100, I think 98 men and 2 women. So I think, and I'm not disparaging Fortune, but it just shows the challenge, I think, we have kind of in society here. So I think for our white men, we hear about this occasionally, but I think if you just look at the numbers, and we typically have, like many companies, less minorities and women. We have higher at the lower ranks, and then as they move up, the numbers get lower. So we do lots of things for workplace mobility and all kinds of things to help in that regard. But I think when you present the facts and figures to our male employees, it's pretty astonishing. And we just relay that this is important for the company. And we're not saying that the next 9 supervisor or manager levels are going to 90% go to women and people of color. It's a very competitive process. But we articulate why it's better for the company and why we can innovate faster. And it's been proven companies that are more focused on, have better focus on diversity and community, have higher employee engagement. So to me, it's all about employee engagement. If you can engage your employees a little bit more than your competitors, you'll do better. And I think this engages our employees, particularly the employees probably younger than me, on the importance of these initiatives.
So beyond diversity and inclusion, can you talk about other socially conscious initiatives you're working on? I understand Boston Scientific even has a corporate social responsibility council.
Sure. And so similar to all the diversity and inclusion stuff, we have a corporate responsibility council. So again, it goes in the same theme. Our employees are motivated by this. I just met with 6 of our Indian employees from our SAIL group, the Southeast Asia group, and they do all kinds of work similar to the Close the Gap initiative with school children. So the bottom line is our employees feel like these things are super important. And again, if your employees feel like they're important, then you engage your employees more, and they're happier, and they work harder, and they deliver, and they take more risk, and the company grows. when employees aren't engaged. So it kind of falls under the why we do it, not only because it's right for the economy, but it's also right for Boston Scientific. So on the CSR part, it's really, I don't know if there's a slide there or not. Yeah, okay, it says, basically it's a goal of carbon neutral by 2030. So we're a large manufacturing company. We have about $12 billion in sales by then next year. We have many manufacturing plants around the world that suck up a ton of energy. And so we made a lot of investments by our operations team over the years. So now we have, we're one of the largest employers in Costa Rica. We have 2 carbon neutral plants that were designated carbon neutral 4 years ago. Now we have 2 in Ireland. And our goal is to have every facility at Boston Scientific carbon neutral by 2030, which essentially means all of the energy and carbon that you burn gets reused in the facility and gets returned around for air conditioning and heating. So you kind of have a closed loop process. And that requires capital investment. So we are upgrading many of our plants, and we're doing so in sequence to hit this target. And we have about 1/3 of our plant network now that's carbon neutral. So it's everything from solar panels to reducing gas emissions. And so it's a big capital investment. And we do it, again, because it's the right thing for the world, but it's also selfishly important to our employees and ourselves. And so that's why we track these things, we measure them. It's always confusing at our lunch because there's like 15 recyclable bins. Now we have to have pictures on them. So it takes like 20 minutes to leave the cafeteria because you're not sure where to put stuff. But eventually you somebody younger than me tells me where to put it. We need a half tuna sandwich. I don't know where that goes usually.
This slide here that you guys can see gives you a little more information about your carbon neutral effort. We have the slides. Can I go back to the slide, the 20, which way do I go? Here it is. So this is the 10, 20, 40 goals by 2020, right? Mm-hmm. And then, do you want to talk a little bit, I forgot to ask you about this, gender pay equity. You've been tracking pay by gender for several years now, right? Tell me a little bit about that effort.
Well, this is an easier one for us because our results are good. And now that I have a daughter in college who needs to find a job, I'm happy that we're in good shape here, although I don't think she'd ever work for Boston Scientific, too close to her dad probably. But basically what this says is in many companies there's a gender disparity gap on wages. And maybe we're lucky, maybe we're had the foresight over years, but we really don't have one at Boston Scientific. This is basically say there's like a 0.1% gap between male and female employees across the globe at Boston Scientific. And what you typically see is by country, there may be larger disparities, depending on which country you're in around the world. But this is a very good metric for us. And it's probably not the work of me, but maybe over the last 20 years, this has been a focus area for the company because we never quite frankly pulled the data until 3 or 4 years ago, and we made some adjustments.
Yeah, I was going to say, are these numbers good because you made?
No, we did. We made some adjustments. In the U.S., we were pretty good. We made some certain adjustments in some other countries outside the U.S., but generally we were pretty close, and so this wasn't a big gap for Boston Scientific.
So if there's not a pay gap between men and women, but how come as women, further along in their careers, how come they don't advance as fast as men? Have you figured, what are some of the barriers that you're working on to make sure that there are more women in management?
I think there's a couple things. Does everyone even know Ken Frazier? He runs Merck. If you never seen him talk, like a YouTube Ken Frazier, he's probably the greatest, I think the best CEO out there, African-American man. And I was at a meeting with him a while ago, and he talked about, and I see this, one is risk-taking. So if I'm a vice president in a company and I need to hire a director, and I'm a white male, and I'm used to working with Joe, Bob, and Tim, and Susie and somebody else are different from me, it's just an easier selection process to choose somebody who's more similar to you. And so you have to encourage your employees to be willing to take more risk there. Not risk, but really it's unconscious bias. And so we do a lot of work in unconscious bias training across the company, at every level of the company continuously. So I think that's the first element. One is the unconscious bias that comes with wanting to promote somebody who you may consider in your gut safer because they're more like you. And being aware of that issue through unconscious bias training that we all have these biases, even though we think we don't. But it's trying to be more aware of them. So we have that frequently. I think the second thing is making things many companies are doing. That's just modern ways to work. I work at home probably a day a week. Many people don't ever work in our offices. Some work in the office all the time. And there's no correlation between, I don't think, where you work and how hard you work. So we have a very flexible work environment now, which is great. We didn't years ago. And the third one I see often, and I won't tell the story too long here, but I've learned this through experience now, is, and I think there's been lots of papers written on this, specifically with women. Women are less likely to raise their hand for promotion than men are. And so if there's 10, and I discussed this with my daughter because I've seen it, quite frankly, with our head of HR. Maybe I'll tell the story really quick. She won't like it maybe. But Wendy Carruthers is our head of HR. She's the fantastic HR global leader. When I joined the company, we made a change with our HR leader, and she was running talent management. And I said, Wendy, do we have anybody to replace our head of HR? And no, we need to go external. I asked the guy who we changed out, do we have anybody internal? No, we need to go external. Great, I'll go external, do a search for 6 months. I said, Wendy, why don't you help me out in the interim? She's doing a great job. I'm interviewing all these people. And I go, Wendy, 2 months later, do you want the job? No, I'm not qualified. These are the 6 qualifications. I only have these 4. Okay. Interviewed 2 more people. I'm down to like 1 person I like. And I said, Wendy, you're actually better than anybody I've interviewed. You're better than anybody I work with at J&J. I really want you to do the job. Yeah, but I don't have this 1 check mark. I'm like, you kidding me? So we put her in the job, and she's been amazing. And now we've seen that now that we've gone through this experience, we've seen that with multiple examples where we've wanted to have a general manager job open. And oftentimes we'll approach our female top candidates and they'll say these 6 things I don't have. But the guy, me, we have them all. And so we're aware of this now. And so we're learning from that and trying to pull that up. So I think that's some of the reasons. One is, I think, flexibility. 2, the unconscious bias that people have. And also a recognition that many women won't put their hand forward until they feel like they've checked every box, when the men were more comfortable with it.
I want to talk about this slide because you signed a pledge maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. Is it CEOs in Action? This is a diversity pledge. Is this that slide with this? Is this the truck, the bus that came around?
It's a bus. Yeah, it's a bus.
And I think I think there are maybe half a dozen companies at least, other CEOs who signed this pledge on diversity. But I think a lot of us are wondering what was.
This is just an example. Yeah. We have the setting here is we call it Everyone Makes an Impact Day. So what we do, we have like 35,000 employees, and we help your family members save their lives or improve their lives with our devices. And so what we do, and I'll just give you, before I go to this, because so many of our people don't see the benefit of it because they're in accounting or tax or supply chain or distributions. They don't see the patient impact. So what we do is we bring those patient stories to our facilities all the time. So somebody who's had work on their Parkinson's through our deep brain stimulators, or their AFib cured, or they saved their life with a defibrillator. So we bring those patients to these big events so our employees can see it. And then what we do is we also, besides that, focus on these diversity and inclusion areas. And this is an example recently in Marlboro where we brought this bus out. And I can't remember who funded this bus, but it's awesome. It kind of lends into the unconscious bias training that we have. So we have that training online. We also have in-person courses that you have to go to. And this is a really cool bus that I can't remember who funded it, that travels around the country. And there's different stations on the bus where you're by yourself, and you're just being presented in different situations with minority situations to uncover your own unconscious bias in a very private way. And so it's a great way, real time, for our employees to see that and feel that, and then we sign a pledge to improve.
Going back to the Corporate Responsibility Council and your carbon neutral goals, I mean, how much of this is driven by millennials, who really care about the kind of company they work at, about the moral values or social values of their company?
I think, hand on heart, maybe I'd say 90%.
Millennials?
Yes. I'd say truthfully, when I graduated from the University of Iowa, Harvard of the Midwest.
everybody remember
Nobody else
that.
got
If you
into
remember
Iowa.
one thing, right, from this,
Yeah.
University of Iowa, Harvard of the Midwest.
So back in the 80s, I'm older than most people here. Like there was the movie where greed is good. And so I'm not saying that's how we felt, but when I started my career at GE Medical Systems years ago, these topics we're talking about were never in play. It was all about your business constantly. And that was fine. That's how we grew up. And this really wasn't part of how we worked early in our career. And so I'd like to say this is all Mike Mahoney, but it's not. I think I've been probably a laggard on this earlier, and then I've seen the impact of it maybe for my own kids as they've gone through high school, now college, and also the importance of this with our workforce. So truthfully, I think seeing that has allowed me to put more gas on this initiatives and make it a much higher priority because it's in line with what our employee base wants. And I would say, 30 years ago when I was working, it really wasn't. And so now it's my job to try to ensure we have programs that try to deliver the goals rather than just talk about it as a nice to have. And we have a lot to do, but it's because we're the ones who can prioritize resources and make capital allocation decisions on what we do.
And in your industry, I mean, there's a really war for talent, right? It's very competitive to find the right scientists, the right researchers. So socially conscious initiatives really matter. I mean, I don't know if you know this statistic, but what percentage of your workforce, like millennials, what percentage do they make up? What account for how much of your workforce? Is it
a lot? I don't know. I honestly don't know the percentage. Yeah. I don't know. A lot.
A lot.
It's a lot.
I mean, it's
a lot around the world. I know in China, I think it's like 70%.
Oh, really?
So it's huge.
Wow.
So I don't know what the number is globally. It's a significant portion.
But it's a lot. It's not like 10,000. I mean, I feel like as I get older, I feel like millennials, they're just that little group. And then I realize, oh, no, they're most of the company now, and I forget.
Yeah. And I've also learned that they work just as hard and they accomplish just as much, but they want to do it not the way that you did it when they're your age. And so as long as we just get over that, there's no difference in productivity or work ethic or smarts. It just has to be different.
You mentioned the Business Roundtable a little bit earlier. That's the influential group of CEOs. And I think in August, they redefined what it means to be a corporation. They acknowledged that this idea that, greed is good. I mean, they didn't say that. I'm putting words in their mouth. But this is the idea that that in the past these companies have put too much emphasis on pleasing shareholders, and that companies, CEOs, need to do a better job of creating really an economy for all. They need to care about their employees, their customers, their suppliers, their community. I mean, what do you think what will it take for these CEOs, the roundtable, to really redefine their corporation? What will it take to do that?
Well, I think a lot of those companies are great companies now who do lots of these things we talked about. Some of them maybe less so. So I think overall, it's a very high-level message. I think it's certainly positive that it's kind of this expression of some of these companies. So it's certainly not negative. I think it's great. But at the end of the day, the other truth is these are publicly traded companies. And to kind of dismiss shareholder value creation would mean you would not have a job in a couple of years. And so I think it's just part of the strategy. If you're a publicly traded company, you have to drive shareholder creation. But then it's simply realizing that I think that we have all these things that we're talking about, engage employees. And it's the right thing to do. And when you engage employees these ways, you actually drive a more engaged workforce. And you have a better chance to drive shareholder value. So I really think it's knitted together. I think it's not practical to say shareholders are less important now than our diversity efforts or our community efforts, because practically speaking, it sounds good. It's not real because they are publicly traded companies. But I think if you flip it around and say, these things actually drive shareholder value is how I look at it. And that's why we put a lot of focus on it.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up for to the audience. So be prepared. So Boston Scientific operates in about 130 countries, and as we know, corporate America is trying to be more socially responsible. What about the rest of the world? Is there another country or policy from another country we should emulate here and bring to America?
Yeah, many. I mentioned Costa Rica. Has anybody been to Costa Rica before? It's the best. If you ever get there, I'd recommend it. They have JetBlue flights now from Logan right there. They have deserts, great beaches, all kinds. So it's a great place to vacation. But we also are like the second largest employer there, and they've made almost a mandate for this carbon neutrality matter. And so we've been ahead of the curve there. The president of Costa Rica recently recognized us with our 2 plants. So I think some countries are more aggressive in setting dates and timelines and tariffs if you don't deliver on those. And we see a lot of that with our European companies in Germany and many others, in Netherlands. Less so in China. We have to work on that. But some countries are making it a clear priority.
So I guess other countries are taking the environment more seriously than we are. And I guess but it seems like companies themselves are, despite federal policy, or they're taking it upon themselves to go carbon neutral here. What about, are there other social policies? I don't know, if with childcare or parental leave, or where do we in America, are exemplar compared to other countries?
Well, I'm not really good on all the stats on all this stuff. I just think about Boston too much scientific. We were behind in the whole parental leave and the spousal leave. And I can't remember exactly how we recently changed our policy, but we were quite frankly behind. So I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but I think we offer, I'm guessing, like 3 months, I think, for the partner who has the baby, and maybe 2 or 3 months for the other partner now. I can't remember. We've changed those dramatically over the past 2 years. And again, it's part of it, candidly, is doing the right thing, but it's also being competitive. And you're seeing better retention. When we moved it from 8 weeks to 12 weeks, and maybe it's 16 weeks now, I'm not sure, that's significantly more retentive to women. That allows them to have a family and not be pressured to come back to work too quickly. And we've heard firsthand that they wouldn't come back unless we have made these modifications. I can't remember if it's 3 months or 4 months now. 3 months. 3 months now. But it's smart for them, but it's also smart for the business, because losing an employee, having to rehire somebody else, train them up, is much more costly than adding 30 more days onto maternity leave.
Okay, we are ready for questions from the audience. We have right here.
Hi.
You win the prize.
Yay.
Free drug-eluting stent.
So you guys ended on a great note, because I wanted to ask about parental leave. And it's one of the, according to a bunch of research, having children is one of the biggest killer of the amount of making equal amounts of money. And you already said that you guys were addressing that in your company, but I thought of another related question. Since you work in Germany and other European countries where you have to give almost a year and you have to give almost 100% pay during that maternity leave, a lot of people in the United States think that will be a business killer, et cetera, et cetera. In your experience as someone who has people working for you where you have to pay them to not work for a year, is it really that bad for the business, or is it something that could be done in America?
Well, thank you for the question. I haven't broached that too much, other than I know our European business is growing extremely healthy, and we have some of our highest diversity metrics in Europe. And so it's certainly not impacting our business. Because you think about that, if you're a workforce, I don't know the math, maybe you do, but if you think of like 35,000 employees, realistically, how many women are having babies per year of that 35,000? Not a huge number as a percent. And so we haven't seen a drop off when it used to be 2 months, now it's 3 months, and I doubt there's been a drop off in 6 months versus 12 months in Europe in terms of our business results. Because what happens is you find, sometimes it's, so what you find other people do the work. On the rare occasion, you find a view that they're afraid to be gone that long, and then their job will be sucked up by somebody else. And so that's not the case. We can't do it legally. We don't do it. But I guess to answer your question, we haven't seen an impact in our European business. I haven't discussed whether we should go from 3 months to 4 months either, but we haven't seen an impact on our business. If anything, you have a more, as I said, a loyal employee when they come back because they're enabled to do that versus one who is frustrated because they had to come back too early and their life isn't sorted out yet, and then they end up leaving 2 weeks later. I should have brought my head of HR with me here. I'm struggling with all these. What was that one?
Maybe the U.S. should have paid parental leave too then, just like Europe does.
Maybe.
I was going to say, Mike, I think she's suggesting you study what happens to some of the women in Europe. I think that actually would be kind of interesting.
Happy to do that.
What happens to them when they take a longer leave? And but that would that's be an interesting data-driven project.
No,
for
I
you.
think I will do that. I think our company, we're not perfect. I think we try to do everything we can to be agile. We have all these services now for, I'm going to mess this up, for women who are breastfeeding. We have all these different services now for FedEx and different things. So we're always trying to figure out new ways to help. And it gets back to if you want to improve your, we call it this dropout rate, when the number of women are, say, at 50%, then they go to 40%, 30%. Why is that? And you're touching on some of the reasons why. And so we're trying to do things, that's why we publish our metrics. We're trying to create underlying strategies to actually improve that. And so thank you for your feedback.
Right here in the front, right here.
Kind of a philosophical little, not about HR stuff necessarily, but in this age we live in, with facts not being facts, the lying that's prevalent, et cetera, I know you mentioned J&J, your company, but I'm really asking you from the perspective of how you hear CEOs and how you see company behavior. From an integrity point of view, admitting to mistakes, whether there's a lot of equivocation happening within employee bases, more or less, given the changes we've seen that are negative from 30 years ago. So just kind of an open-ended invitation to speak to integrity, what you see happening at highest levels, maybe your company as well, in terms of honesty, that.
That's a wide question. Thank you for I part of it, I just think more of, what we can control within Boston Scientific, because it's difficult for me to kind of go beyond that. I'm probably not smart enough to do that, and we have a large organization. So some of just like the basic controls is not maybe integrity related, but the accounting rules that are in place now for the financial disclosures are much more rigorous. And so in terms of financial reporting, I think all the GAAP rules that are in place and the regulatory, I think all those things are good. I think for a larger company, and there's always maybe a few bad actors out there, and nobody's perfect, but I think for me, it's difficult to lead a company this size without kind of walking the talk. And that's why I don't need slides or speaking notes, because it's just like, what are we actually doing? And not everybody's perfect, but I think there's a broader view within most CEOs that many of the topics that we talked about today are really important. Whether they're a 40-year-old CEO or a 65, there's definitely a different movement and swing towards all these topics we talk about, diversity and inclusion, community. So I think all that's good because it wasn't talked about in the past. So I think that's fine. I think you read about things in the media every day about maybe a company did something wrong or a leader did something wrong, and that's difficult. But I'd like to think, maybe more, I'm an Irish optimist, that most CEOs want to be proud of their legacy. They want to be proud of the organization they built. They want to feel good about that. And they also obviously want the company to do well. But it's really difficult. I've been in the job 8 years. you could deliver great financial results for the short term by cutting lots of programs and doing things wrong. But if you want to drive shareholder value for an extended period of time, that means you have to invest for the long term despite the short-term pressures. You have to build an underlying strong culture that will outlive you. And so I think as long as you are in it for the long term and not making short-term decisions that may do poorly for the longer term, then I think you're good. But I think most people that I know really try to do the right thing. And you read about some things, but I don't know. I think most people in the job actually try to do the right thing.
We have time for one more question right here.
Stand up.
As somebody who manages operations like around the world, how have you noticed your business strategy change given like the increased tensions of the U.S. to other countries around the world?
That's a great question. It's really tricky. You have to be very nimble. So in our products, they're heavily regulated devices that go in your body for all these different applications. And so we see all kinds of changing landscape. For example, now, in Europe, they're changing the clinical requirements required for new approvals. And you may have some countries will say, well, in order to sell in our country, you have to have a manufacturing facility. Or in some countries like China, there tends to be some slight preference for local companies rather than multinational companies in terms of how quickly you can get products to market to serve their population, because they're trying to build the technology infrastructure in medtech and biotech to be more self-sustaining on their own rather than relying so much on multinational companies. And so you have to have a company that's thinking for the long term, knowing what your most important markets are, but also investing capital there, but also having the agility to navigate that. And it's a complicated question, but we have manufacturing distributed around the world, and that's one reason we do. We have biggest employers in Ireland. We have a bunch of plants in the U.S., a bunch of plants in Costa Rica, in Asia Pac, and in Europe. So we have a very distributed manufacturing footprint that allows us flexibility when things kind of change. We also have a much more distributed R&D workforce. It used to be all in Minnesota, California, and Boston, and now we have significant engineering and software development in China and India and Poland and different locations. So I think having a distributed manufacturing footprint, R&D, allows us to kind of adapt to the changing regulatory environment, the tariffs, whatever each country or region seems to throw at you in the news. We have a better ability to flex with that or adjust because of our global distribution. If you're primarily only a China company or only a U.S. company, it's more difficult. So I think the larger companies have some advantages when the geopolitical climate's challenging.
Have you had to make adjustments because of the trade war?
So we have to pay tariffs like everybody else, but we actually don't have manufacturing in China. China today is a critical market for us. We actually have R&D and software engineering. But in terms of manufacturing, you're really not getting too much of a wage benefit any longer in China because of the strength of that economy. And so for us, it's more of a strategic market with what they would consider, maybe a lack of tact, higher value premium roles with engineering. So we have more software engineering capabilities, digital and commercial, but less manufacturing there. And so because we don't have manufacturing there, our tariff exposure is less than other companies.
All right, Mike, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the session.
Thank you.